Good afternoon. Welcome to the Smarter Together webinar series. This is the 13th webinar in our series, which started in May, bring you important information on impactful research and community development projects happening here around our state of Georgia. I'm Greg McCormick of Georgia Tech's Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation Group and the director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. Before we get started today with the webinar, I want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and we'll make both the recording and the presentation slides available today on our website in the media area. That link has been provided in the chat area. As an attendee, your audio and video are automatically muted. However, we will be taking your questions at the end of the presentation, so please do utilize the Q&A area to ask your questions of the presenters, and they'll be answering those questions after they conclude their presentation. So we're very excited to have with us today Dr. Carl DeSalvo and Cicely Garrett from DataWorks to talk to you about how they're reaching out to under-resourced neighborhoods and underrepresented groups and supplying individuals with opportunities to learn important computing skills. Dr. DeSalvo is an associate professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication and the School of Interactive Computing with research focused in civics, smart cities, and issues related to participatory design and collective action. And Cicely Garrett is the Business Development Manager of DataWorks. Welcome, Carl and Cicely.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're looking forward to sharing our work on DataWorks today and having a robust conversation afterwards. So I'm Carl DeSalvo, and I'm here with my colleague Cicely, whom I have known for over a decade. This is just the most recent collaboration that Cicely and I have done. And so we're looking forward to the conversation, which is well practiced, having done this together for many years now. So I'm going to begin with a presentation that gives an overview of the DataWorks project. And I'm going to begin by couching that as a research project and telling you about the background to DataWorks and some of our primary research questions. And Cicely is going to join in and talk about one of the projects that we are in the midst of right now. And then we'll back out and talk a little more broadly about what we are learning from DataWorks, and then have the opportunity for conversation. So I'm going to begin with this presentation. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this, and what you're seeing is actually an image of two of our early data workers working in their office over in the College of Computing building, which is where we were based out of until mid-March. And they're busy at work processing data, right? As you can see sort of on the screen and closest to you, there's hundreds of lines of data in an Excel spreadsheet that one of our workers is going through. So what really is DataWorks? DataWorks is two things at once, and this is what makes it particularly interesting. DataWorks is a work development program. It is also a platform for engaged research. And what we do in DataWorks is we recruit people from under-resourced neighborhoods and underrepresented groups in computing, and we train and employ them as data wranglers. So the workers who we'll talk about today get paid a competitive hourly wage. They work about 20 hours a week. That's increasing. And what they do in that work is they do all of the messy work that makes it possible to do data science. And so we're using data wrangling here in a really broad term, and we'll get into some of those details in a few minutes. But what's important to hold together is the way in which this moves back and forth between being a research program and being a work development program. And I think this is what makes DataWorks novel. And it actually is what brings up some of our primary research questions, some of our primary ways in which we can contribute back to communities through this work. And if we can talk about some of the difficulties of doing this, particularly in this moment of dealing with COVID-19. So DataWorks was started with actually support from the Constellation Center for Equity in Computing in the College of Computing. We put together a brief proposal. We shared it with Dean Isabel, and he provided us with funding to get DataWorks off the ground, right? To actually hire our first round of data workers, to bring on Andres and Cicely, to provide space. So DataWorks is actually based out of an office space in the College of Computing building, to provide computers and network access and all the things that we needed to do to essentially stand up a work development program inside the College of Computing. We were fortunate enough to be awarded a 3-year NSF grant as part of the most recent Smart and Connected Communities awardees, which will allow us to grow DataWorks and in many ways to focus on the research. What the Constellation Center for Equity in Computing did that was fantastic was provide us with that seed funding that allowed us to move forward with this as a work development program, and the NSF funding complements that by allowing us to focus on the research. And it's a big project, right? So actually, the PI is Betsy DeSalvo. There are 2 co-PIs, myself and my colleague Ben Shapiro, who is a learning scientist at Georgia State. There are other senior faculty and graduate students and master students involved. We have 2 folks who are part of the team that are employed to manage it. Andres Wong from a sort of day-to-day management side of project direction, right? And then Cicely Garrett, who's here, and we'll talk more, who's helping us build our community connections and our business and actually making everything else happen. And then currently we have 3 data workers who are hired, who come from surrounding neighborhoods, Benice, Jessica, and Logan. So DataWorks is structured around a series of research questions, and I'm going to present those first, go through them in a bit of detail, because it's what distinguishes this program. And I want to be clear, we're at early days in DataWorks. So we launched in January, and we had DataWorks up and running. And then, as you might imagine, everything sort of changed in March. We've continued to run DataWorks remotely and in a distributed manner, but we're still really, I think, in a pilot stage of what DataWorks will grow into. So how does this become a research project? There's sort of 4 questions that motivate what we are doing in DataWorks. And the first is, how can we broaden participation in computing as work? That tagline, as work, is really important because there's a lot of programs out there that look at broadening participation in computing by increasing who can come to schools like Georgia Tech and pursue degrees in computer science, by looking at how computing can come into the K-12 environment. And while these are crucial, our point of distinction is that we're really interested in how computing happens as work, as a job that people can do. And so how do we look at work and the workplace as a way to broaden participation in computing? Connected to that is the idea that this is not just any kind of work. We're really interested in entry-level data work. There's a lot of research out there on what data scientists do and how they do it and how they might do it better. The majority of that research looks at expert data scientists. It looks at folks who have undergrad or masters or PhDs in statistics or computer science. And it looks at computing as something that's done with advanced knowledge. But one of the things that we discovered in our early work is there's a massive amount of work that needs to happen with data in order to enable data science. That's entry-level work. And the question that we're interested in is, how do we focus on that work? And then what kinds of tools are needed to scaffold that? Because the majority of tools out there now are not for entry-level data work. They're for expert data work. Another question that we're really interested in is the question, how can contextual experience be of value to data work? So what we mean by this are the kinds of knowledge that comes from our lives. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of the discussions around data and data work tend to think that data it's inert, right? Like it's just out there. Anyone can process it. It doesn't really matter what you're sort of where you're coming from. A lot of the data that our data workers are looking at is data that they might know something about. It's data that's about the city of Atlanta. It's data about their communities, right? It's data about issues that intersect their communities. And we're really interested in how does that contextual experience not get set to the side in data work, but become a way of actually adding value to data work. So finally, a question that motivates all of this, the question about the university. How can we use the university as a platform for equity and inclusion? This is a different kind of work than we often see happening. What I mean is it's a different kind of research than we often see happening, where the topic of this line of inquiry is the university itself. It's a kind of organizational research theme that looks and says, how do we understand an organization such as Georgia Tech, a public organization that we believe has a responsibility and an opportunity to contribute to public life? How do we actually see that as a platform for equity and inclusion and beyond the classroom? There's a lot of learning that goes on in DataWorks, but none of it's classroom learning. And it seems like we should be able to think about the university as a place where this kind of outreach happens that has real impact on the communities that we are a part of. So this last line of research is one that we're developing and that we think also really distinguishes DataWorks from other programs. Because one way to imagine DataWorks is we've essentially created a small startup inside of the university. And as you can imagine, that comes with all sorts of challenges, which we're happy to talk about. But it changes the way that we think about the university as an organization and how that university might engage in equity and inclusion. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk to you a little bit about, well, what do you actually do there? Like, what does this look like? And so again, I'll begin by focusing on our data workers. These are two of our other data workers. If you remember the picture you saw at the beginning, these two workers were sitting behind those other two workers. And they're here, right? And they're processing data, and one of them's got a spreadsheet open and is clearly taking notes. And this is what they do the majority of the day. But let's talk a little bit more about one specific project that we're engaged in that really marries these strands of research and work development platform. So Cicely, I'm going to advance to the next slide, and I'll let you begin speaking, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. So as Carl said, I am on board as the Business Development Associate. Originally, I was a part of the advisory board. So DataWorks does have an advisory board comprised of different industry professionals from both for-profit, nonprofit, and academia that help advise, provide overall support to the program. I'm still a part of the advisory board, but I was asked to step in a more involved role around February to help with some of the business development. Some of that comes from, I think, my background. I used to work for the city of Atlanta, and I originally met Carl when I was working at Atlanta Community Food Bank. So I have the perspective of who our potential clients would be, as well as their networks. And then again, also with the data workers, it just so happens, I think, me and all the data workers actually all live in the same zip code. So we all live in 30314 for now. So I also am able to communicate with them and also have a view of what their lived experience is on a day-to-day basis. And so we service a wide variety of clients. Some we have demonstration projects that are there for the data workers to learn different skill sets and grow, or those are available to some of our grassroots nonprofits. And then we also have varying payment structures that are still well below what commercial consulting would cost, and different tiers for either nonprofit, then government and academia, and then for-profit as well, to offer clients. One of our most comprehensive projects that we've been working on is one with the Center for Civic Innovation, or CCI, around their NPU initiatives. So NPUs are the neighborhood planning units. There are 25 that cover the city of Atlanta. They were originally invented in 1974 and used to be heavily involved in a really strong vehicle for civic participation with the city. They used to have a lot more decision-making power and involvement with regards to planning. But over the years, some of their effectiveness and how people are involved has waned and ebbed and flowed. And so CCI wanted to take a deeper look into this to see, is this a vehicle that is still viable, and what has gone on over the last 45 years, and how can we potentially better harness this and use it as a better vehicle for civic participation, because it already covers the whole neighborhood. So why not start from where we are? So it is a multi-year review of the city. You can imagine that a lot of the data that has come in is either missing or not always in a uniform format, and there are various phases of this. And so our original phase into this was taking a lot of the meeting notes and zoning data, the ZRB forms that you'll see on the next slide. Many of these were in PDF form. So how can the data workers manipulate key points and data from these forms and put them into a format outside of PDF so that it can be manipulated, tabulated, and be far more useful to the analysis and the report that CCI is trying to do. And so we got several of the files that look like this. CCI had spent quite a bit of time forming relationships with the city planning office to receive this data. And then the data workers take what looks like this PDF that you see here and on the next screen. Then they've put them into various spreadsheets, encoded in other agreed upon ways between the relationship between us and CCI, so that now they can take this in-house and use it as comparison data about, different zoning proposals that have come before NPUs, and then being able to check that against data about how did they end up at city council, what happened to them once they left the NPUs, to ascertain trends, where are things happening more in one part of the city versus the other. And so this is just one aspect of it. The data workers are also providing support on the qualitative side as well as the quantitative. So they are doing lots of in-person interviews now with their stakeholders. And so the data workers are on board to help with those interview notes and to make sure they get coded as well, to be used to also inform the 360-degree analysis that the NPU initiative for Center for Civic Innovation. I think this has also been exciting for the data workers, not just from learning the skill set, but our hope is with this that they are also inspired in their own lives and in their own communities about how they can be more involved in how data plays a role in their life and how they can leverage this to get other things they want to see come about. I can say, for sure the NPU initiative has been very exciting for them. They learn a lot more about their neighborhoods as well as other neighborhoods, and expanding their social networks and horizons. Each of the data workers also has their own personal data project they're working on with the subject matter that is of interest to them that the grad students are helping support them with, so that they can also use their skill set for personal projects as well as those that they are hired for.
Great. So thanks, Cicely. This is a fantastic description of this project, right? And so, like Cicely said, this is kind of characteristic of the work that data workers do. This data did not exist before. And you can imagine that there's a lot of this, particularly in places like City, where there are, I don't remember exactly, but we did almost 10 years worth of zoning applications, which were in PDFs, are now machine readable, right? Thousands and thousands of lines are now made machine readable. And this is the kind of work that they're doing over and over again. So stepping back really briefly, because part of this is a research project. So what are some things we're learning? So these are three really high-level insights that we are developing and actually continuing to pursue. And I'm happy to talk more about each of them. I'll talk about them briefly now. One of the things that we are learning in this idea of broadening participation in computing as work is that, computing as work requires infrastructure just as much as skill. This became brutally clear in the move to distributed and remote work. It's not enough to simply develop a set of skills, right? There's a whole set of infrastructures that need to go into play in order to allow this kind of work to happen. That infrastructure is something that is taken for granted, but is very much unevenly distributed throughout society. And so part of the work of broadening participation is not only, how do these workers learn, but what kinds of infrastructural resources need to be put in place to allow broader participation in computing as work. These are activities that will go beyond simply, let's say, teaching someone how to do a lookup in Excel or how to use Python. Another thing that we learned is that the critical data literacy, right, or the ability to understand the limitations of data is crucial for this kind of data work. Data workers need to understand what's happening when data is missing, why that data might be missing, what other sources might be available to find that data. This sort of critical data literacy is something that often comes about through an expertise with data over time. But in order to support entry-level data work, we need to think about more than just tools for data wrangling, or rather, in thinking about tools for data wrangling, those tools need to have features that enable developing critical data literacy as they work, not as an external kind of event or an external kind of learning opportunity, but actually built into those tools so that as one is sorting through a data set and discovers that all of the data from a missing zip code, what are the ways in which they can learn from that and come to understand why that data might be missing, what other sources they might use to find it, and what it means for the final data set as they cobble this work together. Finally, one of the things that we've learned is that language itself is perhaps one of the most important technologies to develop fluency around. And in particular, the difference between expert and entry-level language is crucial. And thinking about what are more vernacular, everyday language approaches to understanding what data is key to developing a work capacity. For many of us, perhaps on this call, data is something we're familiar with. We understand data at a really conceptual and concrete level. But many people in the world don't. And if you want to work on data, you have to develop that vernacular everyday understanding, which we're learning comes in language. So one of the things, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was saying to add on to what Carl's saying. So at DataWorks, we put a premium on lived experience, just as much as the actual raw data itself, and it matters just as much as what the data is, as who's also manipulating and processing the data. And so we also feel that by recruiting workers from the areas we do, they bring in a different perspective that is often not captured and overlooked. And that is an important key to fully understanding the breadth of the data. So not only are we broadening their exposure, but we're also broadening our exposure and analysis as well by having them on board and actually valuing lived experience as a part of the process. And I think that is key and what sort of sets DataWorks apart from other consulting firms or people that do data. It's being very intentional about all the pieces of the project to ensure that data really is for all and just not a one-sided transaction as it has been in the past.
The one big takeaway from us is this realization, and perhaps it's obvious after the fact, that data work is not data science. That this idea that there's a work that goes into data that is different than the ways in which we train and practice and understand what data science is. And if we really want to achieve these goals of broadening participation and entry-level work and contextual experience, and even understanding the university as a platform, we really have to focus on this idea of the work itself, whereas most of the discussion tends to be focused on the science. And it leads us to this question, which I'll end with before we chat, that's really emerging, which is, what's the labor that makes data science possible? In order for CCI to do an analysis of zoning, there's a lot of work that needs to go in to make that data available before they can apply an algorithm to it. And that's emerging as a really interesting question. How do we understand and value and support the labor that makes data science possible? And how do we do that in a way that's actually fair and inclusive? And that is in many ways the crux of what we are trying to get at through DataWorks. So with that, I am going to end the slides and end our short presentation. And hopefully we can use the second half of this time to have a conversation. And we welcome any questions that you might have about, you might be wondering, how are we doing research on this? What does that look like? You might be wondering more about, tell me more about the kinds of work that's happening. You might be wondering, how do you actually make this happen inside of a university? You might be wondering, what's been the effect of COVID on all this? Any question is fair game. We're here to have a lively discussion about data, work, and equity. So with that, I will say thank you and stop sharing.
So thanks so much, Carl and Cicely. Yeah, everything that you just kind of listed as potential questions are great topics that would be great to explore. I know I'm interested in learning more about maybe who you've worked with so far in the program, if there are companies or maybe the city of Atlanta, or I don't know. I'd just be interested in kind of hearing some examples of who you've worked with so far, the kinds of data that they've given you. I know you kind of spoke to some data previously, but that would be interesting to learn more about.
Yeah, I've dropped a few in the chat box too, but we've been fortunate to have a wide variety of clients, and some of it through some of our previous relationships who are willing to work with us in our early stages. One of our great supporters has been Atlanta Regional Commission. The data workers have helped clean some data that they needed to help prepare for their updates to Neighborhood Nexus and other pieces of data that they use, as data is a big part of the work that comes out of Atlanta Regional Commission. They've also done some projects with Concrete Jungle, cleaning up some of their donor data, and now Concrete Jungle is back again as a repeat client because they have a new CRM system, and so the data workers are going to help be able to move that data so that it's better functioning within their new CRM system. We've done some housing data with Enterprise and Atlanta Housing, some of that making data into machine readable format, as well as coding it and just cleaning up a lot of the data so that it can be used for their next stages in their process. And we've also done some other work with like Atlanta Wealth Building Initiative and DeKalb Fulton Animal Shelter. This has been more taking some of their raw data and putting it in visual format. A lot of times it has to do with mapping and others to see different trends, locations of where some of their clients and where their resources are located, as well as visually showing like their footprint of their work. And so making that a livable format so it can continue to live on for them, but so they can put data back out to the public. It sort of covers 6 major buckets of data. Some of those can be snapshots for people if you're using it for like annual reports or grant reports or things you just want to drop in, and or you may have data needs but can't afford to have a full-time person in-house all the time, but they're fairly routine. Data workers are also available for monthly sort of ongoing data needs that are fairly routine, but someone needs to stay on top of, especially if you are needing it for grants and other reports on a routine basis. They're here for some AI. They do a lot of data cleaning. We've been looking to make some partnerships with other partners like TechBridge and others who help people go to new software, but may not have in-house services to clean data, so that we could become a resource for that. But for the most part, we're open to hearing any sort of data project someone may have, and seeing how we can partner and work together to ensure that your data needs are met, and coming up with something that both parties can be satisfied with at the end, as well as maybe identifying some areas that people may not have thought of but would be really helpful to where their data goals and where they're trying to go with it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's exciting to hear that you guys have worked with the Atlanta Regional Commission. They're a big partner of ours in our Georgia Smart Communities Challenge. That's exciting. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about the process of educating the data workers on how to actually do the skills. Do you have is it kind of online classes, or do they in person and kind of teach them the skills that they needed, or what's the process that you kind of have gone about?
Yeah, great question. So as you might imagine, answering that question is part of our longer term research, because there's not a lot of work on how you actually do this kind of workplace learning. There's some, but there's not as much as you might imagine, and particularly around technology work. A lot of the work that's been done, for example, on developing data literacy, has been done in one of two contexts, either K-12, which is inappropriate because these are adults, right? These are grown people with rents to pay and families, and it's not a K-12 environment. Or there has been some work done like this around civic engagement, but again, those are a different context where you show up for some sort of a workshop to learn about civic data because you're interested. The way that we approach it is on a project by project basis. And so for each project, what we end up doing is developing a series of activities that try to teach the data workers the core concepts that are needed. We have, and we split that between the research team. So let me give you a really concrete example. As Cicely mentioned, the data workers are actually doing a qualitative analysis project now around interviewing city council members, other folks who are part of the NPU system, and then coding that those interviews as data. And so as part of that, Cicely trained them in note-taking techniques. I put together a template for them to use in Excel for coding and analyzing qualitative data. We did a demo that walked them through that, and now there is a regular review process, right? So with each project, we're scaffolding their learning by creating materials pretty much on the fly. And our goal is to do that for the first 6 months, year, and then to step back and begin to try to formalize that and say, okay, what are some common patterns in the learning challenges that we're seeing here? What are some ways in which we can build tools that span projects? But right now, it's almost prototyping tools on a project by project basis. And so as part of that, then we schedule into their week, like, okay, we're going to have training on Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 1 to 2:30, and it's a very hands-on training activity. We do draw on learning theory and participatory design to structure some of that, and we do really try to give the data workers agency, like in deciding what's the best way to approach this. So, we'll put together a learning module and they will go through it, and then it's a open environment where they can say, yeah, this template's not really going to work for us, and here's the reasons why. And so we adapt the learning in that way.
And I will say we've learned also that a holistic learning approach is needed for this. So it's not just about teaching them the techniques about the data. While they are beyond K through 12, they're still younger adults. And so this is a new workplace environment for them, even if they've had jobs before this. So they're all right now in the 18 to 24 range. And so also working on just soft skills and overall project management skills so that they become more involved in the process, and that at some point they can also lead and be more active in the process is key as well. And making sure we provide those other wraparound services and support so they can be successful in this job. So I think, most of the techniques we've taught them actually haven't been hurdles for them as far as adapting and learning to it. I mean, they're young people, they are already friendly with technology before they came to this. It's the other pieces of it that you need to go to work, and the understanding and be in an environment where someone asks your opinion and really wants you to reply back is new for them, because most of their environments have been where people are just, telling what you do all the time and you do tasks related to that. And I will say that COVID has complicated this. So because there was definitely a much better camaraderie and an ease of training when they were all together and could learn from each other and feed off each other in the same room. And we've managed to adapt remotely, but it's still some limits as to where we want it to be on the continuum as far as providing training and their adoption of it. And just, for themselves, like needing to be in the room and preferring to be in the room with other people. And then you also get into the connectivity issue of it all when it's outside of a controlled environment on campus, and just, the environment offered at their respective homes for having a quiet place to work and a stable internet connection. These are all hurdles that have come about with COVID that we've had to address about how to continue to do this program remotely when it was never envisioned in that light.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I can see that the education that the individuals are getting is, it's a process, and they're coming from somewhere and they're going somewhere. Have you found that there are certain skills that have helped them that they should have when they join the program? And where do you hope that these individuals eventually end up? I assume that the skills that they're getting are hopefully setting them up for jobs in the future. But where are you kind of helping them to get to?
I mean, for your second question, right now we're hoping that they stay with us for as long as possible. And we've lost one already who was hired into a position inside the College of Computing, right? And so we actually took that as a win. I think that, what we're hoping, so the model of DataWorks is that it will continue to exist for at least 3 years, right? So there is a model in which one answer to your question is for the next 3 years, we're hoping as many as possible stay here. We're planning on bringing on more. Then there's two other answers to your question. One is, there's actually a lot of jobs out there to do this kind of work, right? There are jobs out there to do data wrangling, and we would hope that they would be able to go on to do those kinds of jobs for organizations or companies who need the data processed. There's another line of inquiry that we're really interested in, which is what would it mean for the data workers themselves to end up becoming the owners of DataWorks? So I'll be the first to say we don't really have an answer to that yet, but it's an interesting trajectory to think about that you start a program inside of a university, and at the end of that, the result is a spin out, which is not that uncommon for a university, but in this case, it's a spin out that would actually be owned and run by the data workers. Like, to me, that would be a really fascinating and I think exciting possible future for them.
That would be very unique. That would be exciting if that's the way it ended up. So how do individuals get involved with the program? Is there kind of a recruiting process that you go through, or are people referred to the program?
Yeah, so ideally, when we first envisioned this, we thought that the workers would be part-time sort of until June. And by June, we'd have enough work in the pipeline to move them up to full-time. But lo and behold, in mid-March, COVID hit, so it's pushed back some of our deadlines, and our goal was to have 10 workers by the end of the year. So we're still on pace to be moving the workers to full-time coming next year, and then to start to bring on some other work, more workers once feel like we have a solid pipeline of work. We do work with other partner organizations just to make sure that the workers have a full support system. Quite a few of our last workers came from Raising Expectations, which works with students from middle school and high school age and some of the areas where we want to. It's sort of like an after school and an enrichment program. So they have a longer term relationship with them. And so we pulled from the Raising Expectations and other partners who have a familiarity with the young adults and opportunity youth who would be ideal for the program. And so we look to continue to grow those relationships and also get some new relationships with other organizations similar in other neighborhoods that we want to recruit from, so that they also have that with them as well. Because we recognize this is coming into a new world. We want them to have some familiar supports on board. And so that's how we've been handling it. So right now, we are looking at that we'll likely be able to start recruiting again in the early part of next year, depending on how our flow of projects go, and then continue to grow out from there, either quarterly or every 6 months to keep increasing the amount of staff that we have on board based on our demand.
And how do you go about getting new projects, kind of finding that demand, these new customers?
Yeah, so that's where I come in. Some of it is me reaching out to partners or other people just to even tell them about what DataWorks is. And having preliminary conversations. Sometimes I'm aware of people that have a need. Sometimes it's not even need based, but just here's DataWorks. Can I tell you a little about it? And then we're also on board to help people work through and figure out and design what may be a suitable datable project that meets their needs. We accept a certain amount of demo projects each year. Those we can do up to 100 hours of pro bono data work. And it's usually fairly finite projects that can be done within 90 days. And so we keep a certain amount of those in the queue because those are also learning opportunities for the data workers, as well as benefits from some of our grassroots organizations that may not have the budgets to do so. And then people can also visit our website, which I'll drop in the chat box. And some people message us through that, and it sends us an email and says, I'm interested in learning more, or here's a brief description of the project. And then we reach back out to people and have conversations about what some of their data needs are. We always offer a statement of work, which we go back and forth until it's agreed upon on, and then sign a contract that has complete deliverables, end dates, who will be involved, who's managing the project, in the same way that people would with a formal relationship with a external for-profit consulting agency.
Interesting. And are there kind of industries and or governments of a certain size that you found that are really can benefit from the program? I don't know, potentially data heavy. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head, but have you found that there are certain groups that are chomping at the bit for these kinds of skills?
I think we've been surprised to find it's sort of across the board. So one thing that we've seen is there actually are a number of smaller organizations who don't have these kinds of skills in-house. Right? And so I think that the Cab Fulton Animal Rescue is a good example of that, where they had a large amount of data on dogs that have been surrendered. And what they wanted to understand is like, what's the pattern amongst this data? And, particularly with an organization like that, like they don't have a data scientist on staff, right? It's not, so this is a great service for them. We are also in conversations with larger organizations who do see this as being particularly valuable I think there's some challenges in making that happen right now because of COVID. But, there are, for example, I will tell you, there are other programs that we are sort of looking to emulate that really have leveraged the idea of like, well, how can you use this contextual experience as a way of really adding value? And sometimes those are big programs. So I'll give you an example. If you're doing AI research, let's say, and you're trying to label images, sometimes you want actual human expertise in that labeling process. Another example of that is if you're trying to, let's say, what's another good example? If you're trying to code music, right? So there are actually music recommendation systems out there that employ young people to help figure out all of these subgenres, right? Because at the end of the day, like, I don't know what all these subgenres are, but they matter to someone. And so I think those are bigger organizations that we're also looking at partnering with, and we're hoping that that happens more when we're able to be back in the offices on campus. So there are some limitations due to being remote, which largely have to do with privacy and security.
And I see that Cicely just put a note in the chat about how the workers are trained on data privacy and security protocols, which is very important. And additionally, they sign non-disclosure agreements with the companies that you work with. So all very important and relevant pieces of information. Can you speak a little bit to the open data movement that's happening in governments and how your company might play a little bit of a role in that and helping companies to make data records accessible and open, especially those records that might be just found in paper copies in filing cabinets?
Sure. I think that the project that Cicely showed you from the Center for Civic Innovation is precisely one of those kinds of projects. So the city of Atlanta has been working for quite some time to try to make more of its data open. But a lot of it isn't, right? And that's not their fault, right? Again, it's something that cities have to grow into before it becomes a budget line, before it becomes part of their everyday process. What's now part of their process is notes get taken at zoning meetings and they get saved as PDFs, right? So those PDFs are available on the web, but that is not open data. The work to make that data open is laborious, right? Tedious and time consuming. And I think that's exactly one of the things that the niche that DataWorks is looking at, which is to say, yeah, if you're a government, if you are an organization of any kind, and you want to make use of open data, you actually have to go through the work of making that data open. And that's not, it's laborious and tedious, but it's actually not necessarily difficult, right? And that's the niche, or one of the niches that we are trying to fit within. And I think it's really important on both a really practical level. Like, look, if you want open data to happen, right? Let's roll up our sleeves and make that data open. I think it's also really important because a lot of times in computing and in government, but we have this idea of like, oh, we're just going to have open data, and then we're going to be able to apply all these algorithms, and we'll learn from it, and things will be smart, and we'll be able to make better decisions. But actually, a lot of that data doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist yet in ways that it can be acted on. And so this is why we're saying, if we want to talk about broadening participation in computing, if we want to talk about computing having social impact, we actually need to look at the work that underlies making all of this computing possible.
Excellent. Thanks, Carl. So again, if you do have questions, please submit them in the Q&A area. At this point, Carl, I'll just kind of ask you guys if you have any additional information that you want to share or examples that you want to talk about. We can do that for a few minutes, and we might wrap early if we don't get any additional questions.
I mean, I guess what I would just share, depending on who's in the audience, for both academics and folks outside of academia, I think that for academics, one of the things that's really exciting to me about DataWorks as a project is it's making us who are involved think about our jobs very differently. And it's making us think about the ways in which we do engagement work and work with social meaning very differently, because it's just like the relationships, it's a different set of relationships. And to me, that's really exciting. And I think the thing that, my partner and I joke, like, we haven't worked this hard on a research project for a long time. And in part, it's because it's not a normal research project. But we really think that, really challenging the way in which we structure research and we engage communities and we think about the university, that's like super exciting. And I think that that's one of the things that really motivates us on this. And I would encourage other folks to think like, you can do audacious kinds of things. And in a way, this is a really audacious premise to this project within the context of what's otherwise usually conservative, which is, a university. And then I think, for folks who are outside the university, I would say really push your university partners to meet you where you need to be. That's the thing. That's one of the things that makes DataWorks difficult is at the end of the day, these aren't toy projects that we're deciding on, right? This is a community organization or a part of the city saying, we need this thing. It can't be halfway, right? You have to do it all the way. It has to be done right, and we need it by this date. And I think that having that kind of a push from your external partners is also, it changes the character of the work, and it's really exciting. And it's something that folks outside of the university can and should do more. So.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone, as Carl said, to step beyond our traditional approach to this. And I think move from a place of service. And for years, people champion the term servant leader. I think we're at a place where we need to move beyond that and think about how is it that you make, and so instead of taking a group of students or having them do projects and other stuff for the community, how is it that you become partners with the community and not in a service relationship because there's a power dynamic there that needs to be reset? How can you bring them into the process so that after you leave at some point, there may be different needs, but they don't always need you to access the data and manipulate it. How can, sort of give the man the fish and become more of a partner because they bring something to the table as well as you bring something to the table? And how can this be more of a partnership and less of a service offering beyond the surface? And then you have some longer term inroads with that. And that's how data really grows and how this work really grows and becomes applicable to all and becomes more mainstream, is the more accessible we make it for everyone. And tear down some of those perceived barriers about who this is for and why, and that it's only reserved for a certain group of people who have tools and other stuff to be able to understand and analyze and extract data.
All right. Thank you, Cicely. Thank you, Carl. This is a really unique and beneficial program that you guys are running. So very exciting to hear about this and learn more about it. So everyone, Cicely has made her contact information available in the chat, so please feel free to reach out to her regarding the program if you'd like to become involved or become a customer to the program. We've also made a link available to our media area. That's where the recording and the presentation slides will be made available later this afternoon for you to review. So with that, I'd like to thank our speakers for speaking about their project today, DataWorks. So thank you, Cicely Garrett. Thank you, Professor Carl DeSalvo. Please join us next week on Smarter Together as we continue our webinar into the fall. We do have a special Tuesday webinar next week on voter research and technology, a very timely discussion So please join us for that. That'll be Tuesday at noon. And then we do have our normal Thursday webinar as well, which will be on industry comparison tools for sustainable communities. That'll be speaking to different visualization and data wrangling tools that can be used to look at how communities can bring in companies that promote sustainable ideas in their community and look for topics such as green energy and biotechnology like that. So very looking forward to these two Smarter Together webinars next week. And then we will continue our Smarter Together webinar into the fall as well. We have one lined up for October 22nd and October 29th. And as we get more speakers, we'll be adding them to the website. So please do check back for those future webinars as we line them up. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you Cicely, and thank you Carl.
Thanks for having us.
Have a great afternoon, everyone.